There was a man who was on a trip, businessman on a business trip. He got there on Saturday, did not have anything on Sunday, and he thought he would go to church. He didn't usually go to church services, but he put on his business suit. He went down the hotel lobby, and nobody was there at that hour, so he walked out on the street, and there was a policeman there, and he walked up to him and said, "Sir, I'm from out of town, but I'm looking to go to church this morning. Could you point me in the right direction?" And the officer said, "Well, tell you what, if you'll walk 3 blocks down this way and then go over a block and go down 3 blocks, there's a church up on the hill that I think you'd like to attend." And so the man started walking, and he thought, surely there's a church closer than 7 blocks from here. So he said, "Sir, isn't there a closer church than that?" He said, "Well, yes, there are a couple, but that one's on the other side of my beat, and I usually get over there about the time they let out of their services. And I tell you, those are the happiest people in St. Louis, and I thought that might be the kind of church that you would want to attend." Now, I wonder if people notice us leaving our services, or perhaps know us at work, or across the back fence, or extended family, what impression they have of the churches that we attend. Would they be encouraged to attend because of the joy they see it brings us? Can we recommend our religion by our countenance? Can we recommend the Lord by the joy He brings to us? Now, life is not lived on an even plane. We all understand that. Life has ups and it has downs. And no one's going to go through this life without tears, without bruises, without hard times. And it would be unrealistic to say that I'm never going to have a blue Monday. I'm never going to be upset or have a period in my life when my spouse has died, or when I've lost a child, or when I'm going through a relationship problem where, it would be abnormal not to have days of sadness and have a smile instead of a frown. But the tenor of my life, the trajectory of my life, is it positive? Am I more likely to be seen with a smile or with a frown? It was interesting when Nehemiah went before the king sad one day. The king noticed that. And he had not been sad in his presence before. Nehemiah chapter 2. So the king asked him about it, and he was sad because of the condition of Jerusalem and his people back home. But isn't that interesting that he had been in the presence of the king all those times? I don't know how many times, a lot of times, and the king had never seen him with a frown until that day. Now, let's go to 1 Kings 19 and study a prophet sitting under the juniper tree whose name is Elijah. This is a familiar Old Testament text to many people, and yet we have never plumbed the depths of this text. I can tell you there is much to be learned in 1 Kings 19. Let's read verse 4, and then we'll back up and catch up to where we are in the story. But to get the juniper tree, in verse 4, "But he himself went a day's journey in the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree." Your version might have broom tree or a brush tree. This is a small tree that had a lot of close limbs close together that sometimes could be trimmed and used as a broom. So that, therefore, it's sometimes called the broom tree. In the King James, it's called a juniper tree. And he sat down under the juniper tree and he requested for himself that he might die, and said, "It is enough, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers." Elijah says, "My life's not worth living anymore. Just take me, Lord. I'd rather die than live." I suppose most of us preachers, I've certainly had this experience, have talked to people who were in that situation. I remember talking to a man when I was a young preacher, and I had, this first time, I guess that's why it left such an impression, and this gentleman was probably in his 80s at that time, and I was in my 20s. And he said, I visited him pretty often. We got to be friends. He said, "My back is better than it used to be, but my back used to hurt so bad I prayed every day that I would die." You don't know what people go through until you have till you really know them, till you walk in their shoes. And I'm not going to judge him. I don't know what that kind of pain is like. But I'm going to see a man in 1 Kings 19 that was in that situation. He was ready to go. Not because of back pain, but because of heart pain, because of circumstances. Now, as time allows us to do, and we won't get through all this, but I want to look at 2 points. The first point is what discouraged Elijah, and you may be surprised that even though Elijah lived 750 BC, over 2,500 years ago, that the things that discouraged him are the same things that discourage you and me. And then the second part of the lesson is what God did to encourage Elijah. And the same things that encouraged Elijah will encourage you and me. So let's go into this story. Let's see. There are 7 things that contributed to his discouragement. The first one was he isolated himself. You see that in the first part of chapter 19. Ahab had an enemy whose name was Jezebel. Elijah has an enemy whose name was Jezebel, who's Ahab's wife. She's a queen, and she has put a price on the head of Elijah because he killed her prophets, her preachers, that she fed every day. 450 prophets sat at her table. Can you imagine feeding 450 people every day? Those are her preachers. She was committed to Baal, and she took care of those who proclamated his message. Elijah had the great contest in 1 Kings 18, and after God answered by fire, he did what the Old Testament said was to be done to false prophets, and he executed all of them. They were killed. Jezebel heard about that and said, I'm going to do the same thing to you by this time tomorrow. And he knew she meant business because she had already killed all the prophets she could find. He had been in hiding for a long time. So he took off. And he went from Mount Carmel, where the contest was held, to Beersheba, which is in verse 3. That's about 95 miles. And that's a decent journey for us in an automobile driving 70 miles down the interstate an hour. But for them, on an animal or walking, that was a good distance. And then his servant, no doubt, was worn out. There was no price on his head. He stayed in the city. But Elijah didn't feel safe there, so he went another day's journey out in the wilderness. He tried to get lost where she'd never find him. So what's he done? He left those people, 7,000 people, was it? That said that hadn't bowed the knee to Baal in chapter 18, verse 13. He left all of them and fled to Beersheba. He had one friend left that believed in God. He left him there. And he went out all by himself in the wilderness. He's isolated himself in his discouragement. Now, let's put ourselves in the picture. Something's discouraging us. And first thing that happens sometimes is we get home from work, let's say on Wednesday night. I don't really feel like going up there. People are going to ask me about it. And I don't want to talk about it and think about it. And I think I'll just stay home tonight. I don't feel like dealing with it. Stay home. Maybe Sunday rolls around. We come in just after the service starts. We get out, just as soon as it's over. We don't talk to anybody. So that becomes the habit. Before long, somebody looks around and says, whatever happened to, what was her name? A friend calls. What's going on? Missed you at church today. I didn't really feel well today. Well, let's have coffee this week. Well, maybe. Just, give me a call. You call. No, I don't want to today. I'm sort of under the weather. Somebody says, somebody else, I'm going to come by and see you. Well, I don't really feel like company today. Sound familiar? What's happened? We used to heat our house with a wood stove in the basement and a wood fireplace upstairs when I was growing up. And we'd get a big back stick, put it in the back and then put wood in front of it. And that back stick would last sometimes for several days. And then you'd just replace the wood in front of it. And, you get a good fire going, then it burns down, just the coals. You could take a coal with the fireplace, the thongs, take it out and put it on the hearth, glowing hot orange. Leave it there for a little while and come back. You can pick it up with your hand. It's black and it's cold. You put that same coal back in the fireplace on the other coals. Before long, it's glowing orange again. Do you see the point? You take a Christian out of the church, it's easy to get cold. It's easy to die spiritually. But being with God's people, singing these great songs, hearing the Word preached, being around others who have the same struggles that I have. Maybe not right now, maybe not the identical problem, but they have their struggles and they know what it's like and they're tempted. And having friends to encourage us is important. Don't isolate yourself. That's the first thing that contributed to his discouragement. Second thing that contributed to his discouragement was it was after a great emotional victory. Here Elijah has, in the previous chapter, come out of hiding because God has told him to, and he goes to Mount Carmel, and there he has this great contest. He says, whichever God answers by fire, then that's the real God. And the people who wouldn't answer a word, they wouldn't take a side, in 1 Kings 18:17, they said, that's good, we'll do that. So he let Baal preachers go first. They prayed, nothing happened. He began to laugh at them. He said, maybe your God's not home today. You know, he's probably on a journey. He's gone on vacation. Your God's on vacation. Or maybe he's too busy. Or cry louder. He can't hear you. Well, that really got them riled up. And they jump up on the altar as if to say, I'll offer myself if he answers right now. And then they cut themselves and mix their blood with the blood of the animals. That didn't work. Nothing happened. Finally, Elijah repaired the altar, and put the stones, put the wood on it, put the sacrifice on it. And then he did something unusual, dug a ditch around it. And then he told them to bring 12 barrels of water up and pour it on the sacrifice. They filled up the ditch. So there's no trickery here. You know, there's no fire coming from under it because it would have been extinguished. And you could even, you know, if you brought fire to try to light that sacrifice, you would have been able to get it to light, soggy as it was. And then he began to pray, and he didn't even finish his prayer. And God answered by fire, burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the rocks, and dried up all the water. And the people said, the Lord, He is God. The people said, the Lord, He is God. Well, that was a great victory. Can you imagine standing in front of thousands of people, putting your life on the line against these 450 prophets, and this great crowd of people that didn't know if they believed in God or not? Well, that was, and then he won, you know. It was a tremendous emotional victory. But then there's a letdown that now obviously and always follows. Now let me put us in the picture. Let's say that you're in education, and there's a SACS accreditation coming, review, and so you're in charge of it. And so for months, you're making sure every piece of paperwork is filed, signed, every I's dotted, every T's crossed, everybody has everything in place. Because if you don't get the accreditation, you lose your funding, and that's on you for the whole school. And you work and you plan long hours, and finally it comes, we got approved for another 5 years or whatever it is. Let down. Well, you do the next week after that. Here's a wedding. You know, we had a wedding. Our oldest daughter got married last year. You get a wedding. A lot of things go into a wedding, you know. Where's it going to be? When's it going to be? The flowers and the invitations and who's coming and the food. I mean, it's just a lot of things. And you work and you work and you plan, and finally it happens, and they go away on their honeymoon, and you're there cleaning up, and it's like, there's a letdown, you know. Maybe it's a project at work. Maybe it's a bid on a job, and it's a multi-million-dollar job, and really, if this bid falls through, the company is going to go under. But if you get it, it's going to bridge another 2 years. Well, this funding will keep us going at least 2 years. That's on you. You make your bid, you double check every number, submitted, and you get selected. Great emotional victory, but then there's the natural letdown. Do you see what I'm saying? We have those in life. Now, what we'll do if we're not careful is when we have a letdown emotionally from some external circumstance, it will be reflected in our spiritual lives. Sometimes we get so busy, working with our jobs. We quit reading our Bibles like we should. We haven't been praying like we should. We've been missing services, maybe working. But, even if it's a legitimate reason not to be there, it still has an impact on us. So then finally we get through a year of that, and we haven't been reading the Bible. We haven't been praying much. We haven't been thinking a lot about God. We haven't been with God's people a lot. And then the letdown comes. What about number 3? Elijah was persecuted. Don't overlook the obvious here. Jezebel wants to take his life. Now, sometimes our persecution is more muted than that kind of persecution. Matthew 5:10-12 says, blessed are they that are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And then he lists different kinds of persecution. There's all men shall speak evil of you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice, be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. Well, we get a lot more of the first and the third than we do the second, physical persecution. But people say things about us, sometimes lie about a Christian, not because we did something, just because they don't approve of our faith, or they don't like us because of what we stand for. 2 Timothy 3:12 says that all who live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. That means every one of us is going to face some kind of persecution. It may not be deny Christ or die, be burned at the stake, but we're going to be tested for our faith. Now, when we're tested, do we quit? Do we give up? We say it's not worth it. We throw in the towel. That's what Elijah's doing here. He says, my life's not worth living if Jezebel's going to hound me, try to kill me. I'm just forget this. If you're being persecuted, don't give up. Because that's a test. It's a test of God for your faith to see how real and genuine it is. Hebrews 12, really the whole chapter, but especially beginning about verse 6 down through 10. But it's also a test of the people around you to see if your faith is real. Your family's going to judge how the strength of Christianity, not by the church, because they don't know the other church members, but they'll judge it by the people they know, which is you. So if you go through and you handle that pressure, that stress, that persecution well, it brings glory to God, and it gives you an opportunity for them to be drawn to the Savior. The next one is, he was focused on himself rather than on others. Sometimes when we get down, it's all about us. I, me, my. You've got to be careful about limiting focus to a small circle, which is you got yourself, that's the first circle, then your family, extended family, friends, church members, people you live near. So there's these circles that we live in. Well, the more depressed we get, the more likely that circle gets smaller until it's just us. I'm only focused on me because I got this problem I'm dealing with. I'm not concerned about you and you and you and you, me and me. Well, let's see if that happened to Elijah here. Drop down to verse 10. And he said, you can count them yourself, have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, slain thy prophets with the sword, and I, even I, only am left, and they seek my life to take it away. Where was Elijah focused? On himself. Sometimes, a lady said Wednesday night at church service, I started to say I made the mistake of asking her how she was doing. That's the wrong way to say that. But I asked her how she was doing. And she said she was having a really bad day. She was hurting. But then she said, I decided to go ahead and come to church because it gets my mind off of it. There's some wisdom in that. You sit looking at the same four walls all the time. You think about your own situation. You get out and you meet people, you talk to people, and you see, hey, there's other people I wouldn't trade places with. Sometimes I do that. Victor, I don't know if you were you had a teacher. I don't even know who it was now. But some teacher told us that whenever you're discouraged, go visiting. And I've done that through the years. Go visit the widows. I got my problem. I think it's really big. And I go sit in a widow's living room and talk to her. And suddenly my problem gets a lot smaller. I see the medicine sitting on the kitchen counter, and I know she's had to choose some weeks between buying medicine and buying food. I see her try to get up from the couch and see the pain etched in her face. Maybe the walker as she comes to the door. I realize that her children live far away and she's not visited very much. She might even say, you're the first person to come see me this week or this month. And I leave that place. I visited her, but she visited me. Get out of your, don't isolate yourself. And don't think about only your own problems. Other people have problems too. Doesn't mean your problems aren't real. Doesn't mean they don't need help. Doesn't mean it would be abnormal not to try to deal with them. But realize that, don't throw yourself a pity party. Realize that, this is a test, this is a challenge, but I'm going to pass it, and I'm not going to lose my faith during this. Now the next one, boy, you really got to get a clock in here, brother. What time's this over? 12?
12. You'll hear a bell.
I'll hear a bell. Oh, that's okay. The next one is 12. So we got, yeah. The next one, I think I'll do this. This will be the last one, and we'll go to the positives. He felt like a failure. Elijah had preached. Elijah had stood for God. Elijah had killed the false prophets. Elijah had won the contest. But Jezebel sits on the throne. Jezebel's trying to kill him. What good did it do? He felt like he was a failure. Sometimes Christians feel that way. Let's just say here, a preacher moves into a community, a young man, he's really, full of vim and vigor, he's excited, he's zealous, he's, going to set the world on fire, and this church is going to grow, we're going to do great things, and he does work hard, he does preach the gospel, the true gospel, he does teach others, but he's baptized several, but, others have moved away, and it just sort of stayed the same, and maybe one day he looks at the board, and he says, that's practically the same place we were when I moved here 10 years ago. I've worked myself crazy for 10 years and we've stood still. Felt like a failure. Here are elders that served for 20 years, 30 years, and they've stood for the truth. They've made sure the gospel was faithfully preached and practiced. And they look around one day and they say, we've lost a good many through the years. We teach them and we can't keep them, or we've had this guy got mad about this and left, and this family, they did, and they might say, I just don't know that I've done much good. Here's a family member that's been, let's just say a wife, been trying to lead her husband to the Lord. She's been trying for years and said, nothing I've tried has worked. I'm just a failure. None of those cases is a failure. If a preacher preaches the gospel, he's a success. How many converts did Noah have? Well, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, their wives and his wife got on the boat. That's it. How long did he preach? 120 years. Well, he was a preacher of righteousness, 2 Peter 2:5 says. He will be judged by God as being faithful, and he's one of the great heroes of the Bible, but he didn't have a lot of success as we count success. So sometimes numbers are the wrong measure of success. What about elders? Here's an eldership that serves, let's say, a quarter century, and they inherit a congregation that's sound in the faith, that's preaching the gospel, that's helping the community, those who are in need, and 25 years later, those things are still true. Are they successful or unsuccessful? Successful. They have guided the congregation through challenges, and the children that have been born and grown up and married and had their own children still are part of the same church you read about in the Bible and are active members. Others may have moved away. Some may have fallen away. That's the nature of Christianity. That's the nature of a local congregation, but they're faithful. And if you don't convert someone that you really love, does that mean you're a failure? No. They failed to receive it. But if you taught it, you planted it, watered it, God gives the increase. So that's not on us. Now let's change our tune and go to what did God do to encourage Elijah? You have this man here who is discouraged. He's a prophet of God sitting under the juniper tree. God's in heaven. Here's the prayer. God, my life's not worth living. Just take my life. I'm ready to die. Well, how's God going to respond to that prayer? Well, it's very interesting. Let's go back to verse 5. He lay and slept under a juniper tree. Behold, an angel touched him and said unto him, Arise and eat. God sent an angel to feed him. You need something to eat, Elijah. Are you at your best when you're hungry? Sometimes when we've been pushing ourselves like I described a few minutes ago, we don't eat like we should. Maybe we just go through drive-through and grab something. We don't exercise like we should. We don't sleep enough. Maybe stress keeps us awake, or we just don't stay in bed long enough to get rested. Maybe the stress level has raised our blood pressure and our bodies are unhealthy because of our decisions. Does that affect our souls? Yes. Sometimes the most spiritual thing that you or I could do is to go home and take a nap. Rest. Eat. Exercise. Exercise has a lot of benefits, but one of them is it relieves tension. It also gives us time for meditation and reflection. You may go for a walk, think about God. Think about your situation. Come back with a different attitude. So that's what God did with Elijah here. He sent the angel to feed him, and he looked, verse 6, and behold, there was a cake baking on the coals. I guess that's where we get angel food cake, right? And a cruse of water at his head. And he did eat and drink and lay down again. He was so worn out. Can you imagine? He's run 100 miles to the city in the days. Well, he's at the very end of his rope. And before that, of course, was all the contest. So he rests, takes these 2 naps, he eats, he drinks. And then the angel said again, verse 7, Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee. And he arose and did eat and drink. And when the strength of that meat, 40 days, 40 nights. So first thing is, consider your body. Are there some decisions you need to make about being healthier physically that could be contributing to discouragement spiritually? That's number 1. Number 2, what did God do for Elijah? God showed him His power. When you go down to verse 9, well, let's skip that for now. Go to 11. Go forth. Elijah's out in the wilderness in a cave, and God says, Go out and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and break in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake. The Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire. The Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. So he speaks to him. Now, why did God go through all those dramatics? Why didn't He just come the first time in the small, still voice? He's showing him His power. I remember as a child, we had a front porch. We didn't use it a lot. We lived out in the country, and a lot of fields around. And in a thunderstorm, I guess you probably have the same weather patterns here that we have in Alabama. But as a child, sometimes I'd just go out and sit on the front porch. It had a big overhang, and I'd watch the lightning and hear the thunder and the wind and just be impressed with the power of the storm. The power of God. No doubt you've traveled and seen part of the world. You've seen the beauty of God, the falls, the ocean. You've seen. Well, God's not going to come to you in a small, still voice. He's not going to show you a mountain breaking in pieces or the other things that He's done here. But God hasn't gotten weak in our generation. It's the same God that sits on the throne right now that was Elijah's God. He does not get old. He does not get weak. His eye doesn't get dim. His ear doesn't get heavy. He is the same God. He is omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent. So, if He's not going to come to me in these miraculous ways, how can I see God's power? Well, sometimes we get to feel like, well, God, He's not answering my prayer. Maybe He can't fix this. Where do you see God's power? A lot of times when we get discouraged, we set the Bible aside. Maybe we leave it in our pew between Sunday and Wednesday. Maybe it makes it as far as the back seat of the car, and I reach back and get it when I come back in, Wednesday night for the Bible class. Maybe it makes it as far as the kitchen table, and it'll be there, when I head out the door next time, or maybe even on a bookshelf somewhere, but I'm not reading it. Or if I am, it's just perfunctory. It's just, get this chapter read so I can check it off my list and say, if you're discouraged, read about God. Read the great things God has done. Read the great things God has said. Read the things about the love of God as we've discussed today. It's true, and just as true now as it was ever in the past, and it will be just as true tomorrow as it is today. Be impressed with God's power. We also get God's power in preaching, don't we? When the Word is preached, it moves us. So put yourself under preaching. People don't go to gospel meetings a lot anymore, I've noticed. I mean, they do in their local church, but I'm talking about across town. If you're discouraged, go across town to a gospel meeting or a lectureship. Or go across the country if you need to polish in the pulpit or something else that will encourage you. You'll come back. I remember going to camp as a teenager and how on fire you come back from camp for God. You had that experience? The gospel meetings can do that for us. All right. I'm going to have a bell soon. Let's go to the next one. Next one is God asked him to examine himself. He did this twice. Look at verse 9. Elijah's in the cave, and the word of the Lord came to him, asked this question, "What doest thou here, Elijah?" Again in verse 13, "What doest thou here, Elijah?" Okay, we described the isolated Christian earlier, not attending church services, somebody calls, "I don't really feel like going for coffee today." You remember that scenario? Elijah's like that. He's out in the cave. God says, "I got a question for you, Elijah. What are you doing here?" Here's a great prophet. I mean, everybody knows Elijah's name in all the tribes of Israel. He is, the most famous preacher of that generation. Where is he? Hiding in the woods in a cave. What are you doing out here, Elijah? All right. You say, "Well, I'm not a famous preacher. That doesn't really apply." Yes, it does. Who are you? You're a child of the King. He has a purpose for you. He has work for you to do. I mean, you've got a great preacher in this congregation. He can preach the gospel. He can do what he can do, but can he do what everybody can do? Nobody's Superman. Your body might have some part of it that's especially prominent and strong, but it can't do all the other parts. And you let some little part of your body get a disease or get injured, and that little part of your body, might not even be 1% of the body, will have you in the hospital. What about church? You say, I'm not. Are you 1% of the church? Surely. And one person is important. God has a purpose for you. So what are you doing moping around? What are you doing isolating yourself? What are you doing being discouraged? God has something for you to do. God wants you to rally yourself. Sometimes we can give other people better advice than we give ourselves. And I've done this a few times in my life when I was discouraged. And I know this is probably not original, but if somebody came to you with your problems and said, "What should I do?" what would you tell them? It's a lot easier to give advice to somebody else. You say, "Well, this is what you ought to do." Well, do it. Give advice to yourself. We usually know what to do. We just don't do it sometimes. All right, let's talk about the next one. God gave Elijah something important to do. Okay, I got 2 minutes. He told him to anoint 2 kings and so he anointed the 2 kings. Let's say your situation is you didn't get to do what you wanted to do. Maybe you wanted to teach a Bible class, somebody else got selected to teach it. Maybe you wanted to serve as an elder deacon, but for whatever reason you weren't put in those positions. Maybe you really had your heart set on being a youth minister, as I did one time. They picked somebody else, and it's like, Well, if I can't do that, I'm not going to do anything. No. There are other things to do. You know, Paul was not allowed to preach to go north on the missionary journey, Acts 16, to go south. So he kept going forward. Guess where he ended up? Philippi. And the church was started in Europe, Acts 16. Europe may have a door closed, another door closed. God's got something ahead of you. Keep going. There's something to do. So what is it you can do? You know, you might be told, no, you can't do something, but has anybody ever told you, no, you can't go visit sick people in the hospital? No, go visit. It's part of Christianity. Anybody ever said, no, you can't bring somebody to church services with you? No, invite somebody to sit with you during the gospel meeting. Has anybody ever said you can't teach the Bible to your neighbor? No. You don't have to get permission from an elder or someone to teach the gospel. Just do what it says. God has work to be done. Well, I'm going to close with this. We talk about God's love today. Fridtjof Nansen was a Norwegian explorer. Explored the Arctic. And he mapped a lot of the depths of the Arctic. And he was born in 1861, died in 1930. That gives you a time frame. So they didn't have all the electronic equipment they have today. He did it with ropes. So he would let down a rope and he would measure it and then write down at that longitude, latitude, what the depth was. One day near the end of the day, he let out his rope. And he got to the end of the rope and he still didn't hit the bottom. So he just put it that longitude, latitude deeper than that. The next morning he got up and he tied another rope to that rope, let it down. It didn't hit bottom. Deeper than that. Put another rope. Anyway, before it was over, he had tied all the ropes on the whole boat together and let them all down. He never found the bottom. And the last entry at that longitude and latitude is deeper than that. How deep is the love of God? Could you measure it by the love of a parent for a child? That's a deep love. A husband for his wife, wife for a husband. That's a deep love. A patriot for his country, a Christian for his God. Those are all deep loves. But you'd have to say God's love is deeper. You could tie all those loves together. And guess what? Deeper than that. We're going to talk about God's love this week, God's plan this week. Thank you for coming today. And pray for the speaker, for the effect of the lessons, for the attendance, and for the souls that are involved this week. Thank you for your attendance, and we'll be dismissed here in just a minute.